My honor to welcome you here on behalf of the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy and also the Center on Conflict, Rights and Justice. So the Politics Department and CISD are hosting this evening. The title of the talk, The Right to Be Wrong, Academic Freedom, Social Science and Public Policy in the Arab World, which will be given by Lisa Anderson, who I'll be introducing. Craig Calhoun will be discussing. I should say before we begin that I've just finished interviewing Dr. Anderson for SOAS Radio, and I would very much encourage you. I always say this, but I mean it even more today because it was fabulous. It's kind of the interview where you're asking a series of questions and you forget that you need to ask the next question because the answers are so interesting that you sort of get lost. So it's really fascinating to listen, and it's a privilege. I've known Lisa since I was a PhD student at Columbia University. In fact, she supervised many, one way or another, many of our PhDs, those of us in the room who went to Columbia. So I've known her a long time, but it's been a real privilege to follow her career, and it was quite an honor to be able to interview her for the radio and to listen to her experiences thinking about issues of academic freedom, public policy, and social science, both as Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and then, of course, as President of the American University of Cairo throughout the course of the Arab Spring. I always like to tell the story of, Lisa's inaugural the date had been set, and it was, of course, it would have been quite an important event, except that it never happened because it would have been in February of 2011. So not surprisingly, Lisa decided what her priorities were, and giving an inaugural address did not seem to make the top of the list. So Lisa is a specialist on Middle East and North Africa. Her first book was actually The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1820 to 1980. She had a very distinguished career, first at Harvard University and then later at Columbia University, where she eventually ran the Department of Political Science before she went on to be Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, which she did for many, many years, from 1996 to 2008. She then left and went to Cairo, where she was provost of the American University of Cairo for, I think, 2 years before she was elected to be the president, which is a role that she's only just finished last year. So this is an experience that's very near and dear to her heart. She's written extensively and spoken extensively on the topic that she's lecturing on tonight. In 2003, she wrote a book called Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century. And for those of us who were at Columbia University when she was Dean of CIPO, we listened to her develop this thinking throughout a course of, I think it was 3 lectures, which were fabulous. So you should read the book, and you should come back and find the lectures if they were recorded as well. She's also had a series of high-level board appointments which demonstrate her engagement with the public sphere, both at Human Rights Watch, and then she was the chair of the board at the Social Science Research Council. But her engagement within and beyond the academy is obviously very extensive. The gentleman to her right is also very distinguished and very well known to those of us in the academy. Craig Calhoun is director and president of the London School of Economics. It's an honor not only to have you here tonight, but it's a real honor to be able to kind of ask somebody of your status a few days in advance and have to say yes. So thank you very much.
I would do anything to get to have a conversation with Lisa Anderson.
But it's small highs. It was a high for me, so thank you. Professor Calhoun is a very well-known, world-class social scientist. His work is on sociology and connecting sociology to culture, communications, policy, philosophy, and economics. He has been the director of the LSE since 2012. Prior to this, he was university professor at New York University, and then here goes the connection. He was the president of the Social Science Research Council when Lisa was the head of the board, the chair of the board. So we have a long link here, and I'm sure it preceded that by a long time. Professor Calhoun also taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 19 years. He was the dean of the graduate school and director of the University Center for International Studies. He's taught across the world. I won't say more. It's wonderful to have you here. But I'll turn it over to you. Lisa's going to speak for however long she would like to. and then Craig's going to speak, and I think you'll have a sense of the issues of academic freedom and the relevance that they have in the UK context today. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say also.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Thank you to the centers that are hosting, and to SOAS as a whole, and to Craig for joining me. It is true that this conversation he and I will pick up in a little while. We've been having for decades. But it's fun to, once in a while, reconvene and think about the next iteration of it. So I'll talk a little bit about the way I have been thinking about academic freedom as a result of some of the experiences that I've had over the last 8 years in Cairo, but obviously informed by having thought a lot about these kinds of questions for a long time, because they are not self-evident and they're somewhat vexed everywhere in the world. And I want to return to that, but obviously I'm thinking mostly about the Arab world now. And there is a lot to worry about in terms of academic freedom in the Arab world. And most of this I'm sure you're familiar with, and I will not rehearse it at length. But let me remind you of a few of the things that have caught people's attention in recent years. An American magazine reported last summer, that is to say well before the murder of Giulio Regini, the Italian graduate student in Cairo, that, and I quote them, "The Egyptian universities are experiencing the lowest level of academic freedom the country has ever known." Now, it's hard to tell whether there's what level of hyperbole there may be in that. In 2005, Human Rights Watch issued a 100-page report on academic freedom in Egypt. So clearly this has been a long-standing problem, and whether it's gotten substantially worse or not, there wasn't really a moment where Egypt saw the flowering of academic freedom, with the exception probably of 18 months to 2 years in the aftermath of the 25th of January revolution. And that wasn't institutionalized academic freedom. That was all bets are off academic freedom, which I think is a very different thing. Certainly now, academic freedom is not highly prized in Egypt by the authorities. A presidential decree in 2015 permitted the dismissal of faculty members accused of participating in political activities on campus. And more recently, academics have been told that they have to secure prior authorization from the Minister of Higher Education should they want to travel abroad. That policy is enforced disconcertingly and presumably deliberately unpredictably. So it's very hard to tell whether, if you don't secure that authorization, you will actually be allowed to travel. You won't know that until you get to the airport. Nor is the situation much brighter elsewhere in the region. LSE, of course, a couple of years ago had an experience where one of their scholars was refused entry into the United Arab Emirates for a conference because of what the Emirati authorities themselves described as, quote, his views delegitimizing the Bahraini monarchy. And you have to credit the Emiratis for candor. The University of Rabat historian Mahdi Munjib, who had called for dialogue between Islamists and leftists, was banned from traveling from a conference to a conference in Spain last fall. Obviously, as you can tell, tolerance of criticism coming from anywhere, including the academy, is very low on the part of the governments of the region. And this is, of course, where there are governments. That is to say, where there's research of any kind taking place. In many of the countries devastated by conflict, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, there's very little academic work of any kind going on. And that context is part of the problem. The fact that many of the sitting governments of the region are concerned about what's going on right at their borders gives them, in their own estimation, permission to be more draconian and less tolerant than they might otherwise be. So I've been puzzling over what academic freedom is and why it matters for years, but my concern and interest have been heightened by my experience in Cairo. And particularly when a colleague whom I recruited to return to AUC, he had taught at AUC in the past, left for the United States, and decided to return in 2011, political scientist Imad Shaheen, whom you may have heard of, fled the country, fled Egypt, in January 2014 when he was alerted that the Egyptian authorities had issued a warrant for his arrest. He was on the faculty. He called me the night before he left and said, "I'm leaving." And I said, "I can understand that." He was subsequently convicted of espionage and membership in a banned organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course had only recently been banned. These are charges he has described as ludicrous, and yet he was sentenced to death, the mandated sentence for defendants convicted of espionage in absentia. So he is not traveling to Egypt now. I think the likelihood that Imad was a spy, or even a member of the Muslim Brotherhood for that matter, is vanishingly small. He was not unsympathetic to the Morsi government, the President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, like millions of his compatriots, of course. Morsi won a free and fair election. But a colleague of his at AUC, Amr Hamzawi, whom I also recruited to the faculty and who is also now out of Egypt, self-exiled when he was told that he would very likely be banned from travel if he stayed in the country, is certainly no friend of the Muslim Brotherhood, never was. He's as close as there is to a classic political liberal in Egypt. The problem, in other words, is not simply political vendettas. It's not a government going after its political enemies. There is something deeper going on. So why does it matter? Why do any of us care? Why, apart from the obvious disruptions to their families, Imad and Amr's, for example, or to AUC's curricular offerings, somebody had to teach the courses they were scheduled to give, or to the liveliness of the intellectual debates at the faculty lounge, why does the loss of Imad and Amr, and indeed the hundreds of other academic researchers who were exiled, imprisoned, or otherwise prevented from pursuing their professional lives in the Arab world, should anyone care? From the point of view of the region, in part this is because the investments that are being made in universities in the region are substantial. University enrollments in the Middle East have grown by nearly 50% in the last 10 years and are predicted to do so again in the next decade. 97% of the nearly 600 universities in the Arab world were established after 1950, and 70% of them were established after 1991. Evidently, both the government and the private sector believe that higher education is worth investing in, and families are filling these universities with students. So something seems important about the project of universities in the region. But what do they think, those people who are investing, whether they're building private universities or expanding the national university system or sending their children to these universities as students, what do they think will be happening in these universities? That's the real puzzle. Now, in many respects, I think particularly in the Arab world, although I think the Arab world is not unconnected to the rest of the world, and these are things we see everywhere, much of the discussion of what university graduates are going to produce and contribute to the world is really about training. The discussion of the mismatch of the skills of university graduates with the jobs that are available in the labor market is a largely misguided, in my view, but nonetheless question of training. If the regional economy actually had jobs for middle managers with several languages and an accounting degree, there would be plenty of takers. There are lots and lots of university graduates in the region who are unemployed, but I would describe what their university experience was more as training. Most of the universities in the region were originally designed to produce civil service bureaucrats, a sector that is clearly saturated, and the institutions themselves have not pivoted to serve the private sector. But as they do, and as more private universities appear to fill that role, there'll be plenty of adequately skilled job applicants. So if what this investment in higher education is about is training people for a labor market, then it's probably going to serve its purpose at some point. But of course, we who care about higher education and research are not talking only about training. Most of the country, and in fact, at least rhetorically, neither are the people who are making these investments in the region. Most of the countries and the universities within the Arab world aspire to more than that. The reputational benefit of world-class universities. They aspire to be institutions that can serve as engines of growth and sources of innovation. This is in the language they themselves use. And that's where the dilemma is. If you're simply training people to do established jobs, skills that you can convey to them and they will use in the labor market, it's not that difficult to do that. But what is difficult to do is actually sustain education and research. And that's what these institutions say they're designed to promote. If that's what they want to do, they must be prepared to encounter the probing, controversy, and disputatiousness that accompany inquiry. So if you're in the Arab world, the educational tradition is one in which you memorize, pass the test, memorize more, pass the test. Ultimately, you've memorized a lot of things. And in some cases, that will provide you with adequate skills to do certain kinds of jobs. That is not, however, an education that is going to serve you well for the challenges of the 21st century and the kinds of novel dilemmas that anyone in the 21st century will be confronting. And yet, the challenge of inquiry, the challenge of preparing people to confront the unknown, is not being met by these universities. If they will really want to be great or even good universities, they must embrace the mission of their aspirational peers, that is to say, other world-class universities. As Stanford puts it, this entails the cultivation and enlargement of the mind, or, as Cambridge says, nourishing a questioning spirit. So this idea of inquiry is very important to the difference between training and education and being able to sustain the spirit of research, whether it's at the student level or the seasoned academic level. All of this requires the capacity to raise doubts about traditional commonplaces and truisms and express reservations about conventional wisdom, challenge authority, and to risk being wrong. And that's where I get to the title of my talk. Academic freedom is not simply an extension of the classic political and civil rights of freedom of opinion, expression, and assembly. Firing university professors for expression of unacceptable views in the course of their work is obviously a violation of both free expression and academic freedom, but they are not the same. The special character of academic freedom is partly a reflection of the nature of the university historically, in which faculty governance rests on a recognized autonomy. Faculty staff or academic staff are expected to determine what is taught in the classroom, to develop curricula and courses of study, and to establish what is deemed worthy as research subjects and methods. But the special nature of academic freedom is also a reflection of the very definition of education and scientific research. Academic freedom is a special license to risk being mistaken in the service of a greater good, the search for truth and the promotion of social welfare. Were it not possible to risk error, we would still believe the sun revolves around the earth. We would still think it's flat. There would be no potatoes in Ireland or tomatoes in Italy. Hard to imagine, but if Columbus hadn't gone across there would be no antibiotics anywhere, for that matter, no green revolution, no in vitro fertilization, no Google, you get my point. There would be a lot of the things that were reflections of people taking the risks that they're wrong. There is no trial without error, or at least without the possibility of error. And it is still indeed possible that GMOs and cloning and the global surveillance permitted by the digital technologies will someday be deemed mistakes. But mistakes are an integral part of the scientific project. Indeed, physics even categorizes types of experimental mistakes: systematic errors, random errors, and blunders. Obviously, being wrong is necessary and important in education and research. So why does being wrong have to be a right, and why does it have to be protected? It seems to me that there are three fundamental challenges to the project that academic freedom protects. There are economic challenges. Being wrong is expensive and wasteful. There are moral challenges. Being wrong is offensive to God and or the social order. And there are political challenges. Being wrong is a betrayal of the state and disobedient to authority. In Europe and the United States, or I was just in Montreal and Canada as well, the first of these is the most powerful challenge, but it is increasingly a global threat. Since the 1970s, in the United States and indeed around the world, the conviction that governments have become too large, too expensive, too demanding, and too intrusive has become an article of faith. From Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the Washington Consensus, the contraction of the state in the favor of the market was heralded as the new solution to the problem of managing human affairs. We can talk about the myriad consequences of this ideological shift, but in higher education and scientific research, it has meant that the public sources of funding have shrunk, and what remained was increasingly subjected to the standards of the private sector. Today, nearly all funders of education and research, from corporate sponsors to private foundations to tuition-paying families, want to see a quick and tangible return on their investment. A research discovery that's brought swiftly to market, a scholarly article that wins an award, garnered citations or generates website traffic, a graduate's job that pays well. These are the visible, measurable tokens of success. Let me not be misunderstood. They can be useful measures of academic productivity, but they are measures, not the intents or purposes of the work. But as you know, much basic research takes decades and many wrong turns before it bears fruit, much less practical application. Scholarly and scientific work sometimes languishes unheralded because it's ahead of its time. Some graduates hit their professional stride years after they leave the university, seeming to be t-shirted slackers tinkering in their garage all the while. Who wants to pay for all of that? So there's clearly, if not hostility, impatience with academic freedom on economic grounds. In Egypt, as in much of the world today, most parents are both risk-averse and impatient. They want their children in practical majors. So in much of Egypt, and in fact in much of the Arab world, you start at university in your field. At AUC, it is a liberal arts model, and therefore you elect what you will major in after you are admitted. So we have this debate constantly with the families. And no matter how often I explained that my sons had majored in art history and philosophy and had benefited both professionally and personally from that, our Egyptian parents at AUC wanted their sons and daughters in engineering and business. AUC does not offer medicine. If it had been offering medicine, that would have been okay too. And one of the many wonderful students at AUC once remarked that his mother was unusually liberal and said that he could major in anything as long as it was in engineering. So mechanical, civil. Given the uncertainty of the Egyptian job market, this is perhaps understandable. Honestly, you can see where the families are, they're concerned, they're thinking. But it is a sentiment that, as you know, is hardly unique to Egypt. Just as I was leaving office, and I was thinking about this last fall, then U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Marco Rubio was described as having said, outlined his, quote, 3-point plan to allow students to use work experience for class credit, let private investors pay for tuition, and make colleges divulge which majors yield the best paying jobs. Fortunately, he's no longer running. So there is an economic challenge, and we collectively as the Academy, and particularly leaders of the Academy, need to be able to make the case for why it is people should be investing in lines of research or educational experiences that may not bear fruit quickly, and in fact may lead into detours that are ultimately wrong, are ultimately not the outcome you wanted. But you need to make that investment. The moral challenge is a bit more complex in my view, but it is not one to be taken lightly. As is well known, it did no favor to Galileo and Darwin that their research findings seemed to contradict the established order of the world, including the religious authorities of the day. And I think we belittle that motivation for skepticism about academic freedom at our peril. It's easy to mock those who worry that a liberal education will lead to loose morals and social chaos, and that academic freedom is merely a cover for exposing young people to obnoxious and dangerous ideas. But for parents who want the best for their children, and I think that can be fairly said of every parent in Egypt, not to say the Arab world, the possibility that they will fall into error and risk the good name and future of them and their families is a powerful disincentive to tolerate academic freedom. Let's be candid, it is. If you're worried about your family and your children, you're not necessarily going to want to expose them to things that may jeopardize that. Here, let me pause for an autobiographical note that has nothing to do with the Middle East, but I've always thought was amusing. This is not a worry only in the Arab world. My parents, who were the epitome of broad-minded and enlightened liberals in the 1970s United States, sent me to a college that was famous, even notorious, for its progressive pedagogy and politics. They were therefore understandably shocked and appalled when I came home one school break supporting the war in Vietnam. They hid me from the relatives until I had recovered, which of course I did. But it was a salutary lesson, perhaps in reverse, of what can happen when young people are exposed to obnoxious ideas. It is also a great credit to this progressive school that it actually had a variety of views, almost all quite eccentric, represented among its faculty. But I understand how it may be for families and for communities quite alarming and worrisome to see students exposed to ideas that are not consistent with what that community conventions are. And I think we need to take that seriously. The culture of the inquiring spirit can be quite threatening. We need to make the case to millions of thoughtful, caring, and deeply conservative families and the societies that they constitute that academic freedom is neither self-indulgent nor dangerous, but rather a necessary foundation for the education of the youth of their communities. And finally, there's the political challenge to being wrong. It is a treacherous betrayal of the responsibilities of citizenship and disobedience as well. This is most of what we discuss when we talk about violations or infringements of academic freedom. There are two elements here, treason and disobedience. The governments that justify violations of academic freedom usually do so on the basis of the primacy of national security. The UAE rationale for barring our LSE colleague was candid and revealing. As their statement went on to say, and I quote, "The UAE is a strong supporter of the efforts of the government of Bahrain and the opposition parties to resolve their situation through peaceful dialogue. The UAE took the view that at this extremely sensitive juncture in Bahrain's national dialogue, it would be unhelpful to allow non-constructive views on the situation in Bahrain to be expressed from within another GCC state." As I said, very candid, very clear what their priorities were and why they were doing what they were doing. This is, in fact, a more reasoned and forthright effort to justify restricting academic freedom. Most often, the danger is an ominous reference to terrorism, sedition, or other existential threats that, in part because they play on genuine fears, have an air of plausibility about them. As you well know, even the UK is not immune to the suspicion that universities harbor and promote enemies of the state or society. Thus does this government warn that universities, quote, "must take seriously their responsibility to exclude those promoting extremist views that support or are conducive to terrorism." As one MP observed about this instruction, an open and rigorous debate about ideas is itself one of the most powerful tools in the struggle against terrorism. Surely this is therefore counterproductive. Indeed, but if the dangers seem plausible in the UK, I will not comment about the United States right now, it certainly seems plausible in the Arab world, which is clearly convulsed by terrorism and extremism, however you might understand those terms. The growing securitization of public policy around the world since the beginning of this century, 9/11, has made national security a plausible rationale for a variety of abuses of political and civil rights, including, obviously, academic freedom. And so intimations of foreign influence quickly raised the specter of treason. The Moroccan scholar I mentioned before, who was not permitted to attend a conference in Spain, was told that he had been accused of, quote, serving foreign interests, disseminating false information, and undermining citizens' loyalty to public institutions. Ahmad Shaheen was a spy, as you heard. Amr Hamzawi is associated with foreign research organizations. Christian Ulrichson, the LSE scholar, and Giulio Regini were themselves foreigners. In many countries in the Arab world, including Egypt, foreign funding is looked upon with skepticism, and in truth, with some justification historically. Relatively little of what foreign governments, or for that matter, foreign private businesses, have underwritten in the region has been motivated by entirely selfless and enlightened interest in promoting the welfare of the people of the region, as we know, which is why trying to establish the real interests of foreigners working there is a widespread parlor game in the region. The even less savory version of this rationale is when it is the security not of the state but of the regime or the government that's in question. And here I will return to U.S. politics because I don't want to pick on the Arab world all the time. Briefly to quote my former U.S. presidential candidate, Senator Rubio again, who wrapped up his remarks about U.S. higher education with his view of liberal arts colleges as, and I quote, indoctrination camps, protected by the political left because all their friends work there, end quote. This obviously is a partisan attack of little plausibility, but it is often difficult to tease out the distinction between what may be legitimate or at least plausible state security concerns from far more self-serving and partisan rationales for abridgments of academic freedom. This is all the more the case when there are laws against insulting the king, the president, the state, the government, or the dignity of said persons and bodies, which is almost universally the case in the Arab world. And that leads me to the final argument against academic freedom, that its practitioners promote disobedience to authority. Let us acknowledge that they do. Much is made of the importance of critical thinking in a good education and in the research process. Disciplined thinking that is clear and open-minded and informed by evidence and autonomous, not simply memorized and repeated words from before. And that is much of the basis of creativity and innovation. But as anyone who has ever taught in that kind of environment can attest, the process can be a trial. Few people in authority, whether teachers or senior research scientists or university officials or government leaders, aspire to be questioned or criticized. Yet the questioning spirit is intrinsically anti-authoritarian, even subversive. Scientific advance is predicated on challenging conventional wisdom and traditional authorities. Another quick personal story. After President Mohamed Morsi was turned out of office in the summer of 2013, political debate became higher stakes and more contentious in Egypt and on the campus than it had been in the preceding several years. The university's student affairs staff grew concerned that AUC students, always outspoken, would run unwarranted risks for themselves and their university. In face of the new decrees outlawing public protests and new restraints on discussion of the country's political leadership, for example, how should they interpret our policies on free expression for our students? In the spring of 2011, we had a big debate about what the expression on campus policy should be. And the reason for that is that before January 25th, there was no campus expression policy. Because, as with all universities in Egypt, there was an understanding, unwritten, that there should be no politics and no religion on campus. And AUC had much more flexibility in that than most Egyptian universities, but nonetheless, we didn't need to have a policy because there were certain things we knew would not happen on the campus. In the spring of 2011, we had a group of campus task force put together a free expression policy, or expression on campus policy, that was essentially an American style. In fact, we modified Carnegie Mellon's policy because it was easily accessible on the web. And the answer was you could say anything you want. The only restrictions were on time and place, but not substance, not the content of what you said. And there was some discussion. This was prompted in part because we had a lecture hall named after Hosni Mubarak, And in the aftermath of the revolution, there was a lot of unhappiness with the idea that we would continue to have a lecture hall named after Hosni Mubarak. And one of the students, several of the students, tore the plaque on the lecture hall off the wall. And we did not know whether we viewed that as free expression or vandalism. So we had to have a discussion, and then we had a policy, and you can now say what you want, but there are differences between expression and vandalism and so forth and so on. It was in that context that after Morsi was deposed, the student affairs staff began to get worried because our students had appropriately taken full advantage of their rights on campus to say anything they wanted to. What would happen if they continued to say things that they wanted to that were not necessarily any longer legal nationally? So we needed to think, in the face of these, about how to think about expression. So we held a forum for our student affairs staff. And to start, I reaffirmed our status as a law-abiding institution, which is an important thing to be anywhere. And therefore, we could not encourage our students to willfully violate the laws of the land. If it was illegal to insult the President of the Republic of Egypt, which it is, our students should be advised against that. But the campus is not entirely a public space, and I reminded our colleagues, and there is no law prohibiting protests on the AUC campus, as long as they observe the policies that governing expression we had so recently adopted. And although it may be illegal to protest against the government or insult the President of Egypt, there was no provision against protesting the university administration or insulting the university president. The gasps in the room were audible. Who, after all, invites insult? But to their credit, the staff understood the point. The campus is a classroom, and the exercise of academic freedom necessarily includes the provocative, the disturbing, the unorthodox, and the obnoxious. Necessarily. That's what this project is. As it turned out, the tradition of protest on campus continued almost unabated as the students turned their attention from national politics to rallying against the administration's implementation of trustee mandated austerity measures. And in the process, they were not, shall we say, always kind to the university president. But I think it was important, and I continue to think that that's important. I think that it's an opportunity to learn about effective registers and ranges of complaint and dispute, of how to be effective as an advocate, what works and doesn't work in making an argument, in rallying support, and in changing policy. And those are things that people need to know. But a questioning spirit, a lively campus, and an active research community is intrinsically anti-authoritarian, even subversive. Education, and particularly scientific innovation and advance, is predicated on challenging conventional wisdom and traditional authorities, even sometimes presidents. And the costs, and now I'm going to begin to wrap up a little bit, the costs of not tolerating criticism and fostering inquiry is substantial. Egypt is a country that relies heavily on tourism and has no figures showing why people visit or what they think of their stay. It's a country that relies heavily on agriculture and has produced no data on the quality of cultivable land since the 1970s. Several years ago, copies of 2 magazines were seized in Morocco for publishing a public opinion poll showing that 91% of Moroccans had a positive or very positive opinion of the king's performance. Despite the high approval ratings of the king, his performance was not deemed a suitable matter for public discussion. All of this reflects a conviction that knowledge is dangerous. So dangerous, in fact, that efforts to compile data by non-governmental bodies and independent researchers must be strictly controlled if permitted at all. Obviously, this kind of approach is completely inconsistent with the ambitions of these governments and the ambitions of the universities that they've authorized or funded. But overcoming the fear of new knowledge will require a degree of openness and a degree of tolerance of the kinds of debates, including things that are wrong, that they have yet to embrace. As Setli Shami of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, a spin-off of the Social Science Research Council, recently put it, she works in Beirut, one of the problems with social media is that it threatens the long-standing official monopolies on information, stoking authorities what she describes as fear of the wrong information in the wrong hands, even if they're not sure what that information might be. So perhaps the time is right to acknowledge that that control of information was lost long ago. The proliferation of modern digital information and communication technologies has meant that the power that is based on knowledge has slipped irretrievably from the hands of governments and now fuels a popular imagination that will not settle for ignorance, for themselves or their rulers. It's too late. 20 years ago, the population of Saudi Arabia was a state secret. Today, thanks to satellite imaging, the number is public knowledge. Today, GPS can track where refugees are in Lebanon, even if the Lebanese government can't. Digital surveillance of phones and internet connections can find and follow political networks in Libya, even if the Libyan government doesn't exist. Marketing firms can tell how much television Egyptians watch, even if the Egyptian government doesn't know. This information is being developed as we speak. Where governments don't collect them, social scientists and private companies are developing their own data, from big data projects in the cloud to small experiments in the field. That means that the project of fostering the cultivation and enlargement of the mind and nourishing a questioning spirit is all the more important. For those who now have information must turn it into knowledge and wisdom. In many ways, the social science and humanities communities in the Arab world are vibrant and lively and influential, if still fragmented and fragile. The number of universities has expanded. Many more students are exposed to a variety of disciplines. International financial institutions are demanding data that the governments are now having to produce. But as a result of the skepticism and worry that the academic enterprise is fundamentally subversive, too much of this work takes place in the face of enormous impediments. Arab university faculty are typically paid too little to permit them to devote full time to their teaching and research. Data in most Arab countries is scarce and low quality. Across the region, creative arts are poorly funded. And of course, as we have seen in many places, the political environment is not conducive to any of this kind of work. Political authorities rarely draw on the skills and knowledge of their best equipped policy elites and are often skeptical about, if not hostile to, the intellectual independence and critical judgments that undergird genuine creativity and discerning analysis. For some artists and social scientists, duress is an inspiration and a prod to inventiveness. But for most, these kinds of constraints limit the range of their work, the issues they choose to address, the audience they expect to reach, and the influence they can hope for. Particularly for younger scholars, artists, and social scientists, the prevailing atmosphere in the region today has been profoundly demoralizing, if not actually dangerous. The board of the American Middle East Studies Association recently decried the increasing number and scope of attacks on freedom of expression in Egypt, and Hassan Salema, the renowned Lebanese sociologist, wrote that while the current situation in our region is that of a dire humanitarian crisis that is worsened by the expansion of war, conflict, and extremism, we must remain steadfast in promoting arts and culture and lobbying for support of the artists and academics of the region. To learn to use information well, to assess and deploy the facts and pseudo-facts, to sort through truthiness, to find truth, takes time, trial, and error. Yes, education and research may be expensive and inefficient, at times disrespectful and even disobedient. They may require patience, tolerance, and forbearance. But in the end, they are what drive individual creativity, social innovation, and human progress, and that is why we must preserve and protect the right to be wrong. Thank you.
That's fine, stay. I can manage. Well, Lisa is right about everything, which rules out one line of potential discussion from me, but there are others. And I have nowhere near the expertise that she has on issues specific to the Arab world. I want to connect some of these to some general themes. And Lisa herself said, quite rightly, that this is not an issue unique to the Arab world. There are some very distinctive aspects and situations in the Arab world, but there are versions of this issue in many places. And so some things loom larger in some places than others. The issue of prior authorization of travel is not unique. It's something that comes up for scholars in a range of countries in Asia as well as in the Arab world, and can be a challenge. It's actually particularly distinctive, I think, in the Arab world, partly because it is so much at odds with the quest for an Arab-wide intellectual world, one that would cross national boundaries and unite Arabs and speakers of Arabic throughout the region in intellectual inquiry and not contain it within national boundaries. And so it expresses a general anxiety about people disloyally going to foreign places, which could be New York or London, but also a particular anxiety that is rooted in the tensions between national governments, national academic establishments, and pan-Arab engagements, including indeed those of social science with the Council and Setni Shami that Lisa referred to. The issue of the ability to choose lines of work is one that is in many ways universal, and I'm going to say not foreign to us. We don't have the same kind of constraints on choosing our lines of research. I would suggest we have a few. And the general theme of risking error in pursuit of truth is, I think, crucial, but it's also the case that we risk inconvenient truths. And so it's not only the potential for error, of course, but the potential for accuracy that is at risk, I agree. So let me comment just really briefly, because we should mainly be engaging with Lisa. I won't add a lot. In thinking about this, one of the core principles of academic freedom is that it's different from free speech in general. And this isn't very well thought through most of the time, and I'm not going to try to make a general disquisition on it. But there either are or aren't broad rights to free speech in general, say in British society. But there are specific claims around academic freedom that are distinct. And I think that we, including those of us who advocate for both free speech and academic freedom, often undermine the claims for academic freedom by conflating them with free speech in general. On campuses of universities, well, not so far from here, even here, this conflation takes place. And it's dangerous for the claims for academic freedom because the loss of the idea that there is a specific need tied in various of the agendas that Lisa talked about, including research and education and free inquiry, and is all of this linked to the idea that universities are special in some way, that academic institutions are special, and that there are needs that are special, that are distinct from broad free speech claims. There are a variety of issues that run through this, including the ways in which we deal with potentially contentious, inflammatory, and damaging speech, in which we sometimes, it's worth noting, demand a greater freedom than the generalized free speech. Free speech is not an unqualified right in British society. It's not, in fact, a really highly protected legal right. And the potential for speaking freely, causing harm, and being sued for it, or prosecuted for it, is non-trivial. Right? Academic claims to be able to have contentious speakers on campus, people that some regard as dangerous, and to have that free speech, I think deserve special treatment, they deserve protection, that's eroded when we lose the sense of a special university claim. Now there's more to it than that, but I'll just allude to the fact that free speech is a very closely related issue, but not the same as academic freedom, and that's partly because it's not just speech that academic freedom involves. It is indeed a variety of activities that are imperfectly related to that. Some of this has to do with freedom for politics, and the first thing we think about when we think of academic freedom is often the right to speak truth to power, which must be protected, and it must, and there are various freedoms for that. In that, it's worth noting that we ourselves muddle the distinction by blurring advocacy for political positions that have nothing to do with our academic expertise with bringing forward analyses and advocacy in areas which do have to do. So, for example, there are people who do research on a variety of issues, like sexual violence against women in war, who don't just have opinions, they have research-based conclusions. And there are a variety of areas in this in which the distinction between simply having a view and having a view grounded in research is important and bears on entitlement to speak. This is significant, you might note, in the UK because the government has proposed law, which may yet come into force, it's a white paper stage, that would ban all advocacy based on government-funded research. Medical researchers who study obesity would be barred from advocating government policies restricting sugar in drinks going to children, for example. Right? So this is an intrusion on academic freedom. It's not about generalized free speech entirely. It is about advocacy on basis research. Freedom for sensitive research is important, as Lisa says. Some regimes see a lot of research as sensitive, but there are various sensitivities of our own to think about in this, and I'll come back to a complexity of that. All the points that she made, I think, about freedom for critical thought and inquiry are important, and I would just add, they're important for the scholarly work that is done, for the research or the new knowledge or whatever. They're important for the self-development of students, for the educational process. That self-development of a greater capacity is contingent in part on this freedom. That's important to note because we sometimes act as though the freedom comes after. It's a special entitlement for the faculty or it's something else. It's actually crucial to the educational process, that it be for students as well. Now I said there are worldwide difficulties. We can note a variety of cases. We can note the fight at JNU University in Delhi, some expressions of solidarity. So the issue of the government going onto the campus that became a major concern about a year ago and so forth last year. China has a variety of concerns in this area. Let me just mention one anecdotally to sort of comment. We talk about sensitive research. I'm involved in setting up a conference in China on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which has been deemed too politically sensitive to be held at a major Beijing University campus. Okay, so we're not talking about something that is criticizing the Chinese regime. We're talking about something that's just a major area of social decision and questioning in which there would be different points of view on whether there should be restrictions on the development of intelligence systems and how they'd be deployed and so forth. Interesting that that would seem insecure enough. Now that's actually a reflection of a general insecurity. What I want to point to with it is not so much that the world needs one more academic conference and it's a major tragedy that this can't happen, as it reveals a generalized insecurity. Part of the insidious way in which threats to academic freedom work is that they make people nervous about testing boundaries. And eventually they're nervous about testing boundaries that don't even seem very risky. And promoting a generalized idea that you have to watch out, the government might object. And if not the government, your senior colleagues might object. And someone around the university, the president of the university, might object. That it promotes self-censorship. And I would put forward the proposition, the majority of the censorship that restricts academic freedom is self-censorship because of people's sense of the context being risky and dangerous. So the glaring incidents are those where states actually intervene and arrest somebody or stop them from traveling or cancel a conference. But in fact, what that promotes is a very widespread withdrawal from some of the public questioning that might take place. Now this said, I want to note a complexity about our international solidarities that bears directly on academic freedom. I sign petitions occasionally against one or another abuse. The LSE doesn't sign petitions as an institution. And the distinction is important. And when I do it, try to make very clear in my personal capacity, I as an individual scholar am outraged by whatever it is that's at issue. But the institution doesn't. I think it's very important that the institution not take collective policies, even on things where I agree very strongly, say the JNU case or something else. And the distinction is that if the institution is taking a position, then the freedom of individual faculty members or students who may have different views is infringed. In fact, the original formulation in the United States of academic freedom doctrine in the era of World War I at Columbia University, Lisa and I both have roots, involved scholars who objected to World War I and scholars who supported the military involvement of the US, both objecting to the president declaring that the university had taken a position in support of the national war effort and would deploy in service of the war. Those who supported the war said they were being deprived of the right to declare their individual support by it being declared campus policy, right? But more importantly, those who became part of founding the American Association of University Professors, a primary defender of free speech in the United States, objected to the idea of an institutional policy. There was majority support. There's no question there was majority support for the war, for American involvement in the war at that point. That wasn't the question, right? Majority support doesn't mean the whole institution does it. And so just as academic freedom is about protecting sensitive research or innovative ideas that might turn out to be wrong, protecting error, it's also about protecting minority opinions from dominant majorities in many cases. And it's very much linked to an idea that individuals need to have freedom. And so institutions need to protect zones of freedom, and institutions take policies like we support free speech wherever, or we support academic freedom wherever, we support individuals choosing research. But on the more substantive issues, what we're protecting is the right of the individuals in the university to have their positions, which may vary from each other. The issues of collective political speech, I think, are sort of different slightly and troubling from individual. Let me just quickly make two more points moving on. Don't worry, they're both complicated points with subpoints. The first is there's something else going on to be worried about, and Lisa brought it up, and it's not the dominant worry in the Arab world, but it's a big worry elsewhere, which is how the transformation of universities and their funding is itself a threat to academic freedom. So there are these sort of manifest and overt threats. The state security apparatus intervenes. But there's a kind of insidious threat in which what I think are really quite massive and momentous transformations in higher education intervene. Lisa talked about the quite wonderful liberal arts college she attended. I happen to know which one it is. But liberal arts colleges like that are under enormous threat and pressure in the United States. They're sort of disappearing. The liberal arts fields of study and approach to study is threatened internationally and globally. The building of new universities is heavily disproportionate to science, technology, business-related fields. There is a challenge. Now, there are exceptions. The NUS-Yale collaboration in Singapore is a liberal arts model, so it's not universal, but I think there's a big challenge there. And it's not just the liberal arts. What Lisa called the emphasis on training versus education, on building human capital, on evaluating universities in terms of jobs. The Marco Rubio position that she cited about universities should be judged. This actual policy here, right, this is part of what is going to be required by the teaching excellence framework, that we transparently indicate the earnings of our graduates, right? Not bad for the LSE in one sense, right? We have the highest average earnings of any university in the country. But I want to suggest a problem for the LSE and for other institutions, because, especially in a society in which students are graduating with £27,000 and upward of debt, the skewing effect of that focus on earnings can be considerable. Not just about choice of school, choice of field. So since fees began to grow in the United Kingdom, the LSE has experienced a continuous trend of students applying more and more to study finance, accounting, management, economics, less and less to study anthropology, history, philosophy, and that changes the school, right? It changes its character because of the fields people study. And it shapes what it's possible for people to do. Well, that's just an example of a bigger issue about funding. It goes into research funding, it goes into lots of other areas in which our capacity to work in ways that we might think are important gets restricted. There are places, LSE and SOAS are both among them, that are relatively immune to this, but only relatively immune. That is, they're insulated by their high status and the fact that they cater mainly to relatively elite students. In a more extreme way, I taught at NYU Abu Dhabi at one time, right? Which is sort of a bubble within the larger context of the Emirates, not entirely representative of overall Emirati policy on issues of academic freedom. There's great academic freedom at NYU Abu Dhabi, but not when you leave the campus. And it's organized very literally in a bubble. But it's not just NYU Abu Dhabi. It is the case of certain kinds of elite projects that get an exemption and then get a feeling that there's not as much of a problem for the whole society as there is, because we're cushioned in ways that others aren't from some of those issues. I'll skip over a whole bunch of other issues about that proprietary data force conformity. One note quickly, though, the issue that we sometimes do this to ourselves. I said in general we self-censor, but I don't just mean individuals censor themselves. I mean institutions produce internal censorship mechanisms, like being reviewed for permanent status when you're a faculty member, being reviewed for promotion, for pay raises, all sorts of things. And we have become vastly more reviewing. So one of the changes in higher education, particularly in the UK, has been we do a lot more of this organized, centralized assessment than in the past. That's happened gradually over a long period of time. It's had some good effects, it's had some bad effects. But among other things, it has promoted some channeling of research into those places of publication, those lines of inquiry that look good on the ref. And that's enforced within universities because they want collective good results, and it has distorted views. I can tell you that the Journal of Feminist Economics is just not valued as much as Econometrica. And I don't know whether the average article is better or worse, but I know that the consequences of choosing one over the other as a place of publication are enormous and have grown. Last bit on the problems here, Lisa brought this up, and she's right to bring it up, and just mentioned the prevent legislation in the United Kingdom is a threat to academic freedom. It's a significant issue. It not only, and she read from one bit of this, it doesn't only prohibit the exercise of free speech deemed extremist and contributing to terrorism, it prohibits it if it's extremist, period. Nonviolent free speech deemed to be extreme, whether or not there is any direct or anticipated link to terrorism, is deemed to be a problem because extremism in general is deemed to be a problem. I'm thinking at the LSE that we have to report all of the extremist Hayekians because it could lead to significant violence. But prevent legislation has been drafted in quite an astonishing way. It's way better than the first version of it, diluted a bit in the House of Lords and elsewhere, but it's still targets. It implicitly targets a particular religious group, but even explicitly, it targets what universities are about, and it's a fairly direct challenge here. I'm proud to say, although we will move to fix it, that LSE has just been deemed not in compliance. We will probably comply, however. Visa controls function in this way. Frequently, I won't say more about that, but there are effects of the free movement of scholars that are not Middle East specific in all of this. The Brexit campaign has been an interesting occasion for this. I haven't talked to Valerie Amos recently to know where SOAS stands, but I will note that the Electoral Commission has informed the LSE that it is not in compliance with the requirements of neutrality because at a speech at LSE, Angel Guerra, the head of the OECD, said that he thought Brexit would be damaging to Britain in the context of the OECD. And we have been told that we are not in compliance, that we must produce evidence that we will not bring such speakers in the future and invite them to make such speeches. Now, note the slippage from the image of the radical Muslim extremist, right, into, well, the Labour campaigner for remaining in the EU, to the head of the OECD giving a talk about what he understands the organization economic, what he thinks the economic consequences will be. And we often see a very illusory pursuit of neutrality that is at odds with actually doing the intellectual work we want to do in all of this. It's not only populists that are anti-intellectuals, it is unfortunately the policymakers in many cases. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. That was absolutely fabulous and made more apparently so also, Craig, with your remarks that brought out several of the key themes. I was really especially glad to hear each of you stress that freedom of expression and academic freedom and freedom of speech are not the same thing. And you both alluded, we spoke about this earlier as well, but I think it's still unclear what those lines are, so it might be something we want to discuss. I'm going to open it up. Please raise your hand, say who you are, where you're affiliated, and keep your questions incisive, because we have about 20 minutes or so. Lawrence, if you'd like to go first. And stand up, actually, since...
I'm a teacher at the economics department. I have a question about we have a debate in our department in the school about the boundaries of the classroom, essentially, where academics like myself, engage in social media, Twitter, Facebook, personal blogs, and I would like to hear both of your opinions on whether the academic classroom expands in your view to include those types of mechanisms where we may be allocating things that the university itself would not consider to be necessarily research specific, and so, or things, viewpoints that could be considered racist or sexist or Israel or whatever it may be. And so I would like to know what you think about those boundaries.
I actually thank you for that question, because that's the question that I think one needs to go back and forth on. If you look at the way the AUP thought about this in the United States in the 1920s and the 1940s and so forth, it was at a time when we knew what a classroom was. And so you could say, we know what your research is, I know your CV, I know what a classroom is. It was very clear. One of the things that's happened in the last 25 years, it's not only the media that have changed, so you can be tweeting things and your classroom is the whole world, but it's also a shift in the pedagogy. So if I'm talking about a move from training to education, or the way we think about education now is increasingly experiential. So we want more and more of our students to have experiences out of the classroom. That's part of their education. So in the years you're at university, you should also be involved in extracurricular activities. You should also be involved in student government or orientation programs or advocacy, whatever it is. And we think this is a good thing. And in fact, at AUC, as of this year, we have a co-curricular transcript that we will now be able to show to employers that this is the things that students did besides going to class and getting grades. We think this is a good thing, but it raises exactly that question. To what extent does the faculty advisor of Group X have authority, protected authority, to speak to the issues of Group X as undergrad? So then, if you use the American example, American universities have, as long as I've known them, have groups called College Republicans and College Democrats. And they get very organized, especially around national election times. They're students. Part of the point of these organizations is that they're learning in their extracurricular activity. Is that part, the mistakes, the being wrong? I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat. He should not be saying this to these students in the College Democrats Club. I'm not actually a Republican, don't misunderstand.
I am actually a Democrat.
So I think that the part of the reason why this is not as clear as we would hope it to be, because I do think we collectively need to make this distinction, part of the reason it's not as clear is because we've gotten lazy over time. But I also think part of the reason it's not clear is our whole conception of education and what constitutes the experiences that contribute to an education are changing. So if we stuck with academic freedom and research, then presumably there is a way to say, sorry, you don't know anything about that, that's not your research arena. But to say, but actually, you are the advisor of this club, or you're playing all the other roles that academic staff play, then it becomes complicated. And that's where, so if we thought this was, a flash in the pan, this way of teaching and so forth, then we could say, well, we'll just wait it out. It's not. It's not, I promise you. Over the course of the next couple of decades, more and more of the experiences of students are going to be taking place out of rooms like this with rows of desks. A couple of years ago, we had a building that we've subsequently torn down, but we were trying to figure out what to do. It was on top of Rear Square, it was empty, we didn't know what to do with it. So we used it for our architecture students as for a studio. Design us what you would do with this building. So they all decided that it would be a, quote, classroom building. It had no classrooms in it. It had little pods and coffee places and what we would describe, what our generation called lounges. You know, that's where you take your laptop and you talk to people.
I mean, kind of like a library.
Exactly. But the point is, you know, that I think that part of what we need to be doing is thinking about that. That education and associated inquiry, whether it's classic research or it's broader definition, are taking place in realms that are new. What does that mean about the line between, if you will, ordinary for expression and the special license that academic freedom needs to entail?
Yeah.
Do you want to add something?
Well, I think that says most all of it. I'll add only a related distinction is between merely expressive use of social media or whatever else it is, and those things that one can say were directly organized in the educational or other endeavor. And that's a blurred boundary too, but it's going to be important, I suspect, to trying to uphold any claims to protected speech in this area. And it's another area in which we've muddled this ourselves by blurring in the idea that, you know, I get angry and I say Donald Trump's an idiot or whatever it is, with and something I actually think I do have the expertise to make that judgment, but I can't claim to have done the research to back it up.
It's been peer reviewed. So we have several other hands. Would you like to? And if you say who you are.
Yes, my name is Nadia Ali. I'm teaching here at SOAS in gender studies. Right. So I think what I found really important is this balance between, on the one hand, pointing out what's specific about Egypt and the Middle East, and then the wider issue, because I think too often we fall into the trap of exceptionalism. But I wonder if, you know, the risk of framing the whole debate in terms of the right to be wrong, in some ways implies that there's a way to be right. And I think for me, that's part of the problem in the debates often, that it's this black and white, there's right and there's wrong, and lack of recognition that there might be different perspectives to an issue. And what I know about higher education in the region, it's really the crisis in the social sciences and the humanities, as you point out. So I feel a bit uncomfortable with this framing. But I think what I'd like to push you a little bit on, in terms of the specificity, we know that one of the big problems in terms of academic freedom is particularly this idea of something from outside, whether it's spies or Western infiltration. Huma Hudfa, many of you might know, who is a Canadian Iranian anthropologist, has just been imprisoned, and again the same idea that she's bringing in, she's a spy, she's bringing in sort of Western ideas about women. Now AUC and all the American universities in the region have a specific position there. I mean, they're American institutions. And I have to say that myself, when I was a student at AUC in the 90s, was very upset when there was a big debate when some students actually attacked teachers because they were not happy with the grades. And they said they went to their parents, who were powerful and linked to the military, and then the various professors were asked to take off certain readings from the reading list. So one famous case was Didier Monsieur, who put Maxime Rodinson's Mohammed on the reading list. But there were other fiction which had a little bit of sexuality. And the administration at the time went along, and staff were forced to take off the reading list. This created huge outcry, and many of us felt that because of the specific position of being a US institution, I mean, you put it in terms of we have to be lawful, but there's a thin line as well, and I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that.
I think my version of that, if you will, at AUC was that having that special position, which AUC does and the AUB does, and AUB doesn't really have to worry about a government, though, in the way that AUC has to worry about a government. imposes certain particular responsibilities precisely to push back, precisely to say, I mean, and this is why I use the language of the right to be wrong, because what the Egyptian authorities worry about is that AUC is full of wrong ideas that are going to pollute the minds of young people. And I think the point is to be able to say, you may think that's wrong, but it actually has an important purpose. So take a deep breath, you know, be confident, it's going to come out okay in the end. It's going to look wrong now, but it's important that this... So part of what I'm trying to do, and you're right to point this out, and I'm glad I have an opportunity. I do actually have a sort of specific audience of saying all of you collectively, authorities, who are afraid that things are wrong, you know, that obnoxious ideas, something wrong is going on, need to recognize that there's actually, that this is part of a process that's a process you say you want to be happening. You want innovation, you want, you know, university, you want all of this. Well, this is why it's there. So, and I think, at least while I was at AUC, and I must say, I'm not sure this is going to last forever, but we certainly we thought that was something we should do, that we should, you know, repeatedly say, this is the function of a university, this is how education works. Part of the reason why AUC is as privileged as it is it has alumni. I mean, I always said, you know, the interesting thing about serving under, so, you know, this joke about having been the first and probably last AUC president to have served under 4 presidents of the Egyptian Republic. We had an alum or a parent or a faculty member in virtually every government. And that in itself is, 1, the privilege, 2, the connections, 3, we are not partisans, we're about Egypt. And to be able to say that was part of saying, look, the way we're teaching people is serving Egypt, even if in any given moment it seems like these students are being exposed to these terrible things and it shouldn't really be happening. I think it's a case to be made, and I think an institution like AUC has a responsibility to make that case. These days, it's a harder case to make. People aren't listening. The nice thing about the first couple of years after the 25th of January is that people were listening in a way they're not now. The anxiety, and so forth. I still think that that's what, that if an institution like AUC has a contribution to make beyond the producing the next generation of the elite, which is what in part it does, as an institution, as opposed to a producer of individuals that are more sophisticated and so forth than they might otherwise be. As an institution, that's the point it should be making. And, you know, it does mean you have to explain why that's on the reading list. And you want to be able to say, that is the faculty's prerogative. But instead, you engage and you say, this is why, and then people debate, and you get much more sophisticated people after that. And so
come right back here. If you stand up and again, say who you are.
Hi, I'm Nadim. I'm studying economics here, a master's degree, and I was actually a student at AUC, and halfway through my undergrad, the Egyptian Revolution erupted. And this is actually a very good conversation. I was going to ask, thank you for asking your second question, especially because as a student at AUC, and I've been there on the Mubarak, and then the revolution erupted, and then afterwards, Dr. Lisa, you're talking now about how the administration was pushing back, which was probably true, but as students and as active students, from our perspective, it was very frustrating. It was more like the administration is just doing the role for the authority. As an authoritarian regime there, we had to fight back a lot for like what's allowed, how to campaign. We got a lot of censorship and also self-censorship too, because some students were like, okay, they're never going to pass this, they're never going to accept this. We had meetings with members of the administration where they would basically just scrap off things that are not allowed to be used on flyers because it's too political. And so in a way, from my perspective, it feels like, yes, universities as entities should not be, should not take any parties, whether pro-Muslim Brotherhood or CISA or whatever, but they should take the very important and active position of defending freedom of academia and freedom of expression in a way. And so when especially AUC have some autonomy and some privilege, as you said, I didn't see how AUC acted in a way to protect and fight back for these values instead of just being this administration that was implementing whoever was in power and whoever wanted what, whether Mubarak or after the revolution where we can see more freedoms, or right now in a way. And so it would be great if you can give us more of your perspective about how the administration has been fighting back, because this, at least from my perspective, this is definitely not how I see it, and I'm sure I'm speaking of a lot of other students and activists.
Well, I have to say, there are points in time that I think are different. And I have to say, I think two things happened virtually simultaneously. I was appointed president and Mubarak was ousted. I can't speak to what happened before that. I was provost. I was privy to some of those debates. But the sense of the administration of AUC before I became president, when Mubarak was still the president of the Republic, I think the general sense was, on the part of the students, was that the administration was designed, or student affairs was designed to, like the syndicates in Egypt, they weren't about rights, they were about control. So if you think about the role that the National Syndicate of Egypt played under Mubarak, it was labor control, it wasn't labor rights. And then you get the independent syndicates arriving in the spring of 2011. I think I would, fairly characterize the Office of Student Development under the regime before I became president as more on the model of ensuring that what the students did were within the boundaries of what students were supposed to do and so forth and so on. There was not a lot of enthusiasm for student rights as much as there was for control. I think the evolution of that, as with the evolution of labor rights in Egypt, so AUC in many ways is a microcosm of Egypt, I have to say. That evolution was no more elegant or smooth than the issues of labor rights in Egypt as a whole, or the National Student Union. So the student unions in the national universities were similarly, places of contention. The government wanted them to be places where students were controlled, student movement, students didn't want that, so forth and so on. So some of that you saw reflected as this evolved in Egypt as a whole and at AUC. I think the impact of you can't disaggregate the time when I was president and the 5 years after Mubarak. It's very hard to tell what the causes and what the results I'm going to describe are. But I think the results of this 5 years is a student body at AUC that is much more self-confident, much more empowered than it was 6 years ago. And I think that will be sustained despite the fact that there will not be environmental support for that the way there was either in Egypt or probably at the university. But I have to say, one of the things that has been most heartening about the experience of the last 5 years in Egypt in any event is the extent to which you see today a genuinely transformed sense of rights across the country. People aren't acting on it right now. I mean, it's a very complicated, difficult time, as you all know. But we're not, and this is why this question of comparing things to the end of Mubarak is so hard. Egyptians are never going to get back into the egg. It cracked. It's open. Egyptians are thinking about their rights and responsibilities in different ways, and I think that's true of students at AUC as it is generally. Which doesn't mean it's going to be smooth. It's going to be much more contentious for a while, but that's okay.
We have several more hands. Okay. Keep your questions succinct, please. And again, if you stand up and say you want.
Thank you very much,
We're going to
Professor.
carry on for another 10 minutes.
I'm just going to ask you about a different country.
Did you say who you are?
My name is Reem Abdullah. I teach here at the Politics Department. So one of the greatest tests for us as we think about academic freedom in Middle East studies at the moment is the question of academic freedom of the Palestinians. And we've seen various moves towards academic boycott in US associations and over here. So I'm curious to hear your views on that, how we can show support, and where you might see some challenges. And secondly, if I may, just I always teach, I reach for your article on political culture, the critique of political culture when I'm teaching. But I didn't sort of recognize some of the things you were saying about a deeply conservative society, and we didn't sort of talk about class so much and the attitudes of the parents. So I'm curious if you could just break down the picture of the attitudes of Egyptians to academic freedom that you have come across beyond just sort of the larger picture of rote learning and new knowledge production. I think you must have many colleagues in the Egyptian universities who are anxiously producing research and toiling under the same constraints. So we can talk more about these complicated.
You might want to just take the first one, and the second one is for the drink, which is coming in fairly soon.
Part of the reason I used my own family as an example of a family who was shocked and appalled by what happened to their daughter when she went away to school is because I don't think it's unique to the region. I think that investment of families in young people is human. So one of the things I think has happened, so obviously the case that I give you is sort of in reverse, but they were still invested in me and they were still appalled by what happened to me, and I think that is a universal experience, or you certainly hope it's a universal experience, because I think you want parents to care that much and you want them to be challenged by what happens to their young people at school. I think that's what you want. I think, so in that's what I mean about conservative. I don't mean politically conservative or even culturally conservative so much as caring about the family. And I think that's certainly more articulate in Egypt than it is in New York, but I don't think it's actually that different. I think that dynamic is, as I said, pretty universal. I do think one of the things that's changed, and I can't figure out why, I haven't. If you talk to people who teach in the United States today, teach undergraduates in the United States today, and you talk to people who teach at AUC today, they will tell you they interact with parents far more than they did 25 years ago. Everywhere. And I don't know, I'm sure there's lots of speculation about that. But one of the things that struck me about AUC, but it was because it was the first time in a long time I'd been a dean of a graduate school, so I hadn't dealt with undergraduates very much, and then I arrive at AUC and I'm dealing with undergraduates a lot. Boy, the families are everywhere. So at first I thought, boy, this is Egypt. It's not Egypt. The families are everywhere with undergraduates. And any
they
of
live at home still.
What?
Because they live at home. They don't during college, but they
Oh, no. But so we've used, the vast majority of Egyptian students live at, Egyptian students, but AUC students live at home. So of course you think, well, that's, unique and, that's not. Well, you go back to New York. Guess who's living at home? One of my sons. So there's something different about it. So anyway, that's not a complete answer to this question of is there something different, or did I conclude there was something different in my experience? I think it's more different generationally than it is regionally or culturally.
We have several hands. Okay, why don't you go? We'll take these two, actually, if that's okay. We'll take these two because we're going to finish in about 5 more minutes. You need to go. But there are drinks, so you should stay if you have time. Go ahead and talk over people.
All right, so,
say who you are, please.
So I'm former AUCian, and I'm a student.
I have him in class.
Yes.
But you also have a name, presumably.
Yes, Abdurrahman Hassan, and I do Masters at King's now, but my question is not to Dr. Lisa. It's about New York, Abu Dhabi.
Okay.
Your experience
Yeah.
there. Because you've said that there are a big degree of academic freedom within campus. But then knowing the UAE government, because I've lived there as well,
Yeah.
they don't let anything run under their nose. They the state is heavily surveyed. So
They were fully aware, yeah.
we were fully aware. So was that part of gaining legitimacy or appearing, like onlookers from the outside to be more legitimate, or was it like a sincere contribution to like the quest for academic?
Don't answer that yet, because we're going to take the second one that was right over here.
Yes.
Yeah, again, if you stand up.
Yeah.
You don't have to stand up if you don't want
Yeah.
to. Just say who you are.
I'm Hashem. I'm an AUC graduate as well. And I signed out pre-married.
And a SOAS student?
Pre-married.
Queen Mary, sorry.
Yeah. So my question to Professor Lisa. First, thanks for the very interesting speech. And I owe you an apology because I was one of those students you talked about who wasn't very good to its president. And then, in fact, and I know Professor Lisa will excuse me, it puzzles me a little bit when sometimes the speaker condemns things that, like, she seemed earlier not to really condemn, and she seemed earlier to be okay with, and maybe part of. Like, I don't want to be a party pooper and go through events in which she
Keep your question
or our
relatively
institution
succinct.
in AUC, headed by President Lisa, oppressed student freedoms, penalized student activism, plotted with the state security against their students, wrote to police and
Can you
even
ask
private
sorry.
guards to disperse student
Question.
demos and organized generals in the state security to actually incarcerate students. But no offense intended here. The question is to Professor Lisa. Is actually related to the classical paradox which arises when political academia is met with political practice. In fact, we student activists in AUC, especially the ones on the left, like myself, were extremely excited when Professor Lisa became president because we knew her profile as a critical academic and as a progressive educationist. But then
You've got to
it
ask a
turned
question.
to be, yeah, I got a question, yeah, sure. It turned to be the extreme opposite. Like, it turned to be a period that had many authoritarian practices. So my question now, my question is that this is about this ethical dilemma, which I want to stop at and ask. When Professor Lisa herself became President Lisa, and she was obliged to deal with the authoritarian state, and I don't want to assume any bad intentions from Professor Lisa. Actually, I know Professor Lisa in person, and I know she's a good person. Yeah, I know she's a good person and a kind-hearted human being, but she had to.
You have one sentence left, sorry.
Yeah, so having to deal with an oppressive state and having to do like oppressive practices, how do you evaluate your term as president for 8 years, and how do you advise other educationists and other academics, like many of them might be here, who might sooner or later indulge into public policy and public administration?
We're going to come back to the Abu Dhabi question first because I don't want it to get lost because it was important and succinct also. And then we'll come to yours. Did you want to go first, Craig?
Sure. Yes, there's lots of surveillance in the Emirates, and relatively little passes unnoticed. The relative academic freedom of NYU Abu Dhabi on campus has to do with everything from personal behavior of students through to more contentious things, simple things. I taught a class on, basically Marxism on the modern world system, not a typical Abu Dhabi agenda, jointly with Emanuel Wallerstein. So, it was obvious that we were not endorsing all of the line. That said, it's worth noting that the Emirates state, like almost every state, is not completely unified. There are different voices and people with different agendas. So those who backed setting up NYU Abu Dhabi and keeping it free had an agenda of modernization, relative liberalization, pleasing an international community, acquiring a reputation. Lisa alluded to some of the kinds of goals which are also common to the American universities and other things. And not all shared that agenda, and others had stronger anxieties. And in particular, it matters that it was Abu Dhabi and not certain others of the Emirates, which was both more liberal in some ways and had a state that felt confident enough to do this, so that NYU Abu Dhabi could do things like invite Israeli speakers, which was impossible anywhere else, and did, and had Israeli speakers, and so forth. And on that, it's worth noting that the LSE conference, from which the researcher was turned away, that Lisa alluded to earlier, was in Sharjah. And it was not the Emirati state that turned the researcher away, or that the Emirati customs enforcement stopped him, but the ban was issued by Sharjah. And so you have to see these complexities when you talk about states.
Which has an American university.
Which has an American, at which the conference was to be held, but had a local state which panicked over the potential paper about Emirati assistance to the repression of freedom in Bahrain, that's what stipulated. So I'm just saying it's complicated, not that it's good.
Hisham, you and I can talk about this forever, but obviously. But let me just sort of start a conversation on the basis of something Craig said. One of the things that is important, I think, is the sustaining of the institution itself. And I think the reason that that's important is because it should be a place in which the debates such as those that you had and others of your colleagues had and so forth can take place. In order to sustain the institution, I don't think the leaders of the institution can take positions on those particular debates. So, there were people who were opposed to what the student union was doing. There were people who supported what the student union was, people who did so forth and so on. In order to make sure that the institution itself survived in order over the course of time to have those debates and give you a chance, for example, to persuade the rest of your colleagues and the faculty and so forth and so on that whatever it was that you wanted to do would be the best.
I'm talking about the three.
Sorry, no, we're not gonna come back.
So-
You can talk afterwards, because there's gonna be a reception.
Right, what you do, and this gets to some of the, why don't I sound always like myself as a professor? I retain my own personal views, my own research agenda, and so forth and so on. The institution that I have responsibility for cannot be the reflection of Lisa Anderson. It can't be only what I think. It has to be something that transcends and survives that. And that is this space in which people have the right to be, even what I think may be wrong. So as a potential authority figure, I don't want to be in a position to say, sorry, Hisham, I think you're wrong, you can't do it. So I have to do what it takes to sustain that. That's what I think the responsibility of the people who run institutions like this is, and that's what I was trying to do.
Matt has a question here. I want to be sure he has a chance to ask it, and we'll take this and maybe one more, and then I think we'll wrap up. You say who you are, even though
I'm
I
Matt.
know.
I teach in the
Matt
politics department. Yeah. So my question is about some of the anxieties you're talking about in the region and the way they almost directly affect us here, not specifically with reference to manifestations to prevent and sort of analogous situations, but a couple things that I've noticed lately that I think are important, and I'm sure others have noticed this as well. We have PhD students who might have gone to some of the countries in the region, particularly Egypt, and now aren't. Okay? And so that is affecting not only academic freedom, as it were, in the region, but some of the research that's being undertaken outside of the region. And another case that's at least as interesting, in my experience, more interesting, involves representatives of governments from the Middle East, and in my case, South Asia, who are concerned about some of these conversations unfolding with their global student bodies here. Events of concern unfold on our campuses. Representatives of those governments working in town then used to call the university and say, we're concerned about this event, would you please take our concern into account? Some of those representatives are becoming a little more emboldened and contact the students directly and say, we know that you're from our country, we're happy that you're enjoying your experience in London, but be careful. And some of those events then have a hard time moving forward. And we're finding that the academic freedom that we would assume we enjoy, and we do formally enjoy is being informally subverted by some of these practices. It's the migration of those anxieties inside our own student bodies. And I've discussed a particular case recently that is of some concern, and I would be very interested to know how you think we here should address those anxieties and their spillover.
And before you answer that, is there anybody else who had a short question that they'd like to put on the table, and then we'll give Craig and Lisa their final remarks.
Stand
up,
this
go ahead.
order, please.
And where are you?
Ex-SOAS student, commented on BBC and other media outlets, Arabic mostly. A question about here, LSE. I followed the local student newspaper, The Beaver, I think, and I found it sometimes shocking. Students infighting and whatever you feel, sometimes they are breaking the law, committees and whatever. What's your intake about it compared to SOAS in newspaper, if there is one?
Anybody else want to add their voice to the collective joie? No, nobody else. Okay. All right. Final remarks and answers to these questions. Actually, why don't you go first, and then we'll give Lisa any
Give Lisa the
final
major
remarks.
last words. Yeah. I don't know much about the SOAS student newspaper, so I can't compare. The LSE students do lots of things, very seldom illegal. The Beaver covers them somewhat erratically, and is not an altogether reliable source of, it depends on who's writing what. Let me go more substantively to this, because I think it's a really great question, really crucial. And you were really tactful and didn't mention any countries, but let me mention a non-Arab Middle Eastern country for which this is a very serious and growing concern, Turkey. We experience more frequent forms of pressure, not only against students, but against faculty members. They are indeed sometimes direct, as you said. The university then has an obligation trying to provide appropriate support. How we do this is tricky. I'll link this to one aspect of Lisa's answer to Hashim, which is one of our goals, is to maintain a policy in which we don't let London police handle matters in the LSE campus. Everything is handled by our own security. But this poses new challenges as we try to provide protection for faculty who are in some cases threatened rather directly. So we have a bunch of these institutional maintenance concerns colliding with direct protection of faculty and students, colliding with a push towards self-censorship from the we're watching you kind of message, which we try to answer by reasserting our values and indicating that we will support. But what we can say is of relatively minimal solace to people who are worried about what may happen to them and their chances when they go home, or to family members and things like that. And it's a huge issue. We are less concerned about this spilling over into public events, protests or things like that, than we are about the intimidation of individuals.
Lisa.
Yeah, I must say I didn't anticipate that. I've been in New York for the last few months, and I taught a course at Columbia at CEPA, and the course was called Authoritarianism. And it was a graduate seminar, and it had 17 students in it, including students from Colombia, Ecuador, Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, China, Korea, and a few Americans. 4 of the students during the semester were contacted by their security apparati. I was stunned. I have to admit, I hadn't taught at Columbia for about a decade. Clearly this is a new world. Clearly this is something. And these were kind of, what are you taking that course for? They were just probes. They weren't, kinds of, one student tweeted that she had found a book about the military establishment of her home country from the 1960s, and she thought it was kind of funny, and so she tweeted that. Her father got a phone call at home. This is very, very worrisome. I don't know what we're going to do about that. I just don't know.
And it connects to Lawrence's earlier comment.
But this is...
This is where we are. Okay, this has clearly kept people longer than we asked them to stay. They clearly
On
are very,
Friday.
but it's clearly a very important discussion. It's a discussion we've been having at SOAS in the politics department and across SOAS and across the UK, as you know, and clearly across the world. And so to have the two of you, to have Lisa, to have you come over from New York and speak, to be interviewed about this, to speak about this on a Friday night is really extraordinary. And Craig, to have you come and add your experiences and your thoughts. Thank you so much, and thank you.